You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Hello everybody, welcome to our 10th episode of Arts in Isolation. I'm Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and in conjunction with the Barga Trust and with the support of the Al-Tajir Trust and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, we bring you this series. Our last podcast was devoted to the immense economic power that was in the hands of the Malay world. But today, we're traveling west to the coast of India. Some dynasties that spur in India are better known than others. We all have heard about the Mughal Empire and the Maharajas. Yet, today we'll have the opportunity to discover a mysterious sultanate that appeared in South India approximately 600 years ago. The Sultanate of the Deccan. The Deccan produced some of the most striking art in the history of the world and was also a key player in economy, particularly known for its diamonds. And to take us through this journey, we have with us Saif al-Rashidi, director of the Baraka Trust, and Navina Haidar, curator in charge of the Department of Islamic Art at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. Navina has authored several books, particularly focusing in South Asia, and has curated several exhibitions, including Sultans of the Deccan, India, in 2015. Welcome Saif, welcome Navina. It's a pleasure having you here.
Well, thank you very much, Navina. It's really wonderful to have you on our podcast series, and thank you so much for your time and for your interest. When I approached you, I asked you whether you could talk about something related to the cultural history of India, and what you said was that one of the most fascinating areas and period was the Deccan. So could you please tell us a bit about it, when we're talking about, what we're talking about, and why it's important?
Thank you, Saif, with pleasure. So the Deccan region of India is the South Central Plateau region, which in the 16th and the 17th centuries was home to 5 extraordinary kingdoms. And they were extraordinary mainly to me as an art historian because of their art. They had an fluorescence of creativity, of individuality, of artistic inspiration in many different areas. And this lasted just for this 200 years, after which they were taken over by the Mughals. So there's a kind of Mughal hegemony, a North Indian hegemony on the local art scene. And before this period, they were part of a larger empire called the Bahmanids. So they really came into their individuality in the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's what makes them sort of a concise moment in history, rather bounded by these events and these periods. The Deccan region was also interesting because it had access to India's coastlines, which is where all the European visitors and travelers were coming in the 16th and 17th centuries. So you have the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, the English, and the Danes all around the coastline of South India. And these European influences, these people, these ideas and objects, works of art, and artistic sort of interactions interfaced with the history and the styles of the Deccani courts. And in turn, they all had to contend with the imperial Mughal powers up in the north. So there's a kind of dynamism of politics, of influences, and they all met in the Deccan. The Deccan is not by any means a sort of sideshow. It's actually an important key to world history, but one that's not really understood because of this kind of slightly mysterious quality of its fluorescence and the way things have been written. So I guess that's why it's especially rich and interesting period, and its history and the way things unfolded there ended up in a kind of remote domino effect, if you like, influencing events all around the world.
Well, what was it that attracted the Europeans and the Mughals from North India and others to the Deccan? Why was it important?
So the Deccan and India's southern region in general has been rich with all kinds of natural products and artistic and traditions and wealth that has attracted people for centuries. And somebody once told me, quite a chilling remark, to say, the entire history of India can be summed up as the process of extracting the wealth from the south by the north and by the visitors, which is a kind of a sort of, startling but not completely untrue statement for this period, particularly because the Deccan had diamonds in the eastern coast, the Golconda diamond, which later rose to fame in its own right, and the Golconda region was the source of all the world's diamonds from antiquity to the 18th century, after which they discovered diamonds in Brazil and then in the 19th century in Africa. But until then, part of India supplied the entire world with its diamonds. The Golconda coast, the eastern coast, was also famous for its textiles. And a very beautiful and technically advanced form of textile known as kalamkari was produced in this region, which became the rage around the world. And I believe up to 60% of world textile trade was coming out of this region at a certain moment. Then you had important natural resources, other types of natural resources such as the spices, minerals, and so on of varying types. So it's a very rich region and has been the focus of world attention for a very long time. I mean, you even have diamonds in antiquity in the Roman period, which come from the Deccan.
Oh, wow. I never realized that India was so important in the diamond trade throughout history. Were diamonds also very important in Indian culture as well? Or did it solely export them?
That's a very interesting question. I think they were important in Indian culture. The diamond is the world's hardest substance. So understanding how to deal with the diamond, how to extract it, how to work with it has been a kind of technical advance in India and later in Europe, but obviously technically advanced in the regions where it was initially found. But there are, of course, great cultural significance, meaning to the diamond in India. We don't know of medieval and early surviving diamonds in India, or we just know of a sort of early batch of very ancient small diamond octahedral crystals in Roman antiquity, the Roman world. And then there's a great leap forward for almost 1,000 years before you begin from the 15th century, finding much bigger, grander diamonds in late medieval Muslim courts and then with the Europeans. But that in between 1,000 years almost, there isn't a lot of evidence in terms of diamonds surviving. But in terms of the texts, in terms of the culture, in terms of the idea of the diamond, yes, the diamond is mentioned in many medieval texts, recognized as a form of wealth and beauty, luxury of kings, and it has great attributes that are to do with auspiciousness, to do with meaning, to do with interpreting the properties of the stone itself. And so, yeah, there's a great culture, you could say, that has built up in medieval India around the diamond.
And you mentioned kalamkari, which I believe are printed textiles. Why were they so important in a world that was full of textiles?
Well, they were printed and painted because, kalam, the word kalam means pen and kari is work. It's a drawing style which was executed on textiles with areas of the textile that could have also been printed with the help of printing blocks, and then resist dyed with very fast and brilliant colors that were all the rage and were also the technical achievement of this textile. Well, it's because of the color, because of the quality of the textile, because of the quality of the drawing, these became cherished or sought after around the world, and also because of the interesting designs that evolved. And that was partly because these textiles can be very cosmopolitan in their imagery. You can find sort of Dutch figures and Armenian figures drawn into the textiles. You find important historical events recorded onto the textiles. And you also have later in the 18th century a wonderful development known as the Palumpo, which is a kind of tree of life motif, which is the most delightful large flowering tree with fantastical blossoms on each branch. And that may have evolved from sort of Dutch designs and from Indian Gujarati designs, a kind of cultural conversation between design forms that are all expressed in these textiles, which, as I mentioned, have this wonderful color, especially this red that never fades. And no matter how much you wash it, it never washes out. And if you expose it to a lot of light, it doesn't never fade. It just fades very slowly, but it retains its brilliant color. So you do find a lot of European clients and nobility and so on interested in this kind of wear.
So from what you say, is it correct to say that Europeans were attracted by the wealth of southern India, but they also were attracted by the fact that South India could produce things to their taste and to their designs?
Yes, I think that there was a certain amount of design commissions and European taste was coming into the production of all kinds of arts in India in this period, including in the Mughal world. So for example, in the 16th century in Gujarat, you find the production of luxury furniture inlaid furniture, which is being made for both the European market and the Turkish market. And this is really being done to designs that are coming in from abroad, and the Gujarati craftsmen could adapt their designs to almost any taste. Similarly, the Kalamkari craftsmen could adapt their designs for clients in Europe, clients in Southeast Asia, clients in Japan, clients in Sri Lanka, and there have been several exhibitions that have brought this material together, and it's quite a delight to see how creative and how diverse the designs could be according to the clients and the local and the tastes that were being catered to. But that's, of course, just, the eastern coast of the Deccan. If you were to look at the other kingdoms, the things we've talked about come from the kingdom of Golconda. But then you have the kingdom of Bijapur, Bidar, Bera, and Ahmednagar. So these were the 5 kingdoms that flourished in this medieval period. And each one of them has sort of styles of art that became, unique to their court and their artists and their personality, if you like. And one of the delights of studying the Deccan is to sort of see how they all interact and how yet they're all very individual. And so Bijapur, for example, was very famous for its painters. And some of the most brilliant painters, such as the artist Farrukh Hussain, who comes originally from Iran, ended up in the Deccan working for a very sensitive and creative patron, Ibrahim Adil Shah II. And together they made magic with the painted works that were produced at the court. So, if I had to choose one thing for each court, I would say painting for Bijapur, diamonds and textiles for Golconda, Bidri metalwork for Bidar, that gives its name actually to Bidri ware. Ahmednagar also produced wonderful paintings, very few, very rare, but also had an extraordinary, specific painting style brought about by one or two specific artists. And then the 5th kingdom, Bera, is actually the most mysterious because not a single object can be attributed to it during the 16th and 17th century, during this period of independence. But it has magnificent architectural remains, which are very romantic, set in forests, crumbling forts, and that are absolutely, melt into the landscape and echo the contours of the hills, wonderful remains of architecture. So each one has something to offer.
It sounds wonderful, but it also sounds like it seems to have been a center for high quality and luxury production. You mentioned an Iranian painter who was attracted by an enlightened patron, and I was wondering if you could tell us about what was the culture of the period. I mean, why would painters and artists from other places be attracted to southern India?
Well, in the 16th and 17th centuries in general, India became, all the courts of India became very attractive to migrants from all parts of the world, Europe, Middle East, Far East, and to objects and to artists. And the reason for it is probably because they were wealthy, they were successful, and they were also open-minded and interested in new influences, and they had sensitive and intelligent patrons at different moments almost everywhere. So it was a kind of coalition of many factors, but these are the principal ones. Why would anyone want to come to India at that time is because you had the opportunity to make money, and you had the opportunity to be adored and respected and cherished for your talents. And that, I think, is very much part of the whole thing as well. So how does that come about? That comes about when there is already an understanding and a pre-existing taste for you and your culture as an artist. So, for example, when Farrukh Hussain comes to the Deccan, he's coming to a region that has already embraced Shiism. There's a very strong Shiite tradition in the southern Indian courts. And as you know, Iran became largely Shiite after when the Safavids took over in 1501. So there was a kind of, mutual religious affiliation, sectarian affiliation that goes across this particular region. The Mughals in the north, by contrast, are largely Sunni. Then there's another important factor, which is that although I'm saying most of these courts in the south were Shia, from time to time they also adopted Sunnism. It wasn't a sort of exclusive story. And with the Sunnis also came a great tradition of Sufism. So the Deccan became quite importantly the center for many, many Sufi establishments and different tariqas or different traditions of Sufism. And those are very important because the Sufis allowed for a great mixing of dialogues, of ideas, of cultures. So that was again a very important factor that created more of a free thinking, I would say maybe tolerant kind of an atmosphere that invites creative people and invites possibilities of different types.
So the south of India, as I understand it, during this period has different Muslim traditions, different points of view, which encourages creativity. What about Hindu traditions? Do they play a part? And are
Yeah,
there any
I mean,
particular
yeah,
patrons that bring about this cultural fusion?
yes, very much so. So that's where a figure like Ibrahim Adil Shah II is so interesting, because he is somebody who is he was a sort of roughly a contemporary with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who was also a very, very inspired patron. Ibrahim, though, was truly deeply mystical in a way that made him stand out from other contemporaries. He was a poet and a musician. He left a book. A book has been attributed to him, a book of music called the Kitab-e-Noras. He was a sort of free thinker, you could say, who invited a great dialogue between different religious traditions. And he himself very much put himself in the tradition of Hindu culture as well as Islamic culture, in that he saw himself, and he declares himself in some of the songs in this book, as being the son of Saraswati and Ganesh, who are Hindu deities. And he was deeply sort of close, as were many, many Muslim rulers of India and much of Indian court culture, to Hindu tradition. I mean, it was based on Hindu tradition in large extent. Many of the kind of early medieval traditions of Hindu kingship were maintained at the Muslim courts. But beyond kind of the formalities, there's more of a spirit of fusion of ideas, which comes through in the language, it comes through the art, it comes through in the poetry, and so on. And it comes through very much with a figure like Ibrahim Adil Shah, who sort of broke down the barriers, and by declaring himself to be the son of Ganesh and Saraswati, and yet affiliated to Gesu Daraz, the great Sufi figure of the times, pledging, constantly honoring the Prophet Muhammad in his writings. All of this kind of blending of spiritual references tells you what kind of a person he was, and what kind of a mind he had. And then tells you something about what kind of an interaction he must have had with Farrukh Hussain, who was a brilliant, also free thinker from Iran, who came, according to most scholars, I mean, not all the scholars agree on the storyline of Farrukh Hussain, but he came from Iran to Afghanistan, and then to the Mughal court up in the north, and then down to the Deccan. And when he reached the Deccan, he changed. He changed because his art shows a kind of new spirit, a new freedom, a new wild imagination that you never saw in the past. I mean, you saw hints of it in the past, because he always stood apart from his contemporaries in that he operated within the formal, strict canon of Persian and Mughal painting, but always seemed to have a twist to everything that he did, in that his figures were a little bit more alive. The vegetation that he painted seemed always to have a kind of life that broke through in unusual ways. But when he comes to the Deccan, his palette changes. He goes into sort of amazing, skies turn purple and vegetables turn orange, and figures float in space. And I mean, it's a slightly psychedelic, but also all that formal training and control and technique is very much there too. It's this kind of freedom of imagination pinned to incredible discipline that you see in the work of Farrukh Hussain in the Deccan. So we tend to attribute that to the magic that happens when you have a great patron and a great artist get together. Because in this period, all art is produced within that relationship, all courtly art. We're not talking about other levels of art, but the courtly production tends to, always involves a patron and an artist working together.
I think it's a lovely thought, the idea of patronage and creating the atmosphere where artists can take technique and be creative and be a bit wild and use colors that they've never used before. And I think it's a legacy that holds true today, that for artists to do their best, they need the right environment. But are there particular pieces of work, of art, that you think are perhaps funny or unusual that you'd like to mention to our viewers, bearing in mind that we can't see them, but you might describe them?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that's wonderful is the story of Chanchal the elephant. So Ibrahim Adil Shah had a couple of like all rulers, he had an elephant stable, and two of his elephants are actually very well known. One is named Atash Khan, and Atash Khan had a girlfriend elephant named Chanchal. Chanchal means like is the sound of anklets, Chanchal, and Atash Khan is a grand sort of title, sounds like more like a title. So these two elephants, we know were from the sources we know that they were a pair. They were companions to each other. And then into the scene comes Asad Beg, who's the Mughal ambassador from northern India, and he's been sent down, spent several years actually in Bijapur, and leaves behind a very interesting document describing his time there. He's been sent down to negotiate, to sort of get close to the Deccani rulers, and also to bring back a very prized elephant for the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And that elephant has been decided is going to be Chanchal. So time goes on, and eventually the moment comes when Asad Beg is going back in 1604, going back to northern India, and he has to take Chanchal with him. And the two elephants are now going to be separated. And it's a very heartbreaking moment. Chanchal has been portrayed a couple of times in paintings by Farrukh Hussain. And one painting in particular shows her all modestly standing next to a larger elephant behind her, who is Atash Khan. And Farrukh Hussain really captures the relationship between these two elephants in this beautiful, luminous painting that shows them together in this green landscape with purple rocks and luminous skies with tiny dots of stars and little flowering plants and buds all around them. And they're in this kind of dreamy meadow together, and they're just standing close to each other. And he's just this kind of shadowy presence behind her, almost sort of around her, but she's composed in such a way that she's in the foreground, a little bit smaller, a little bit more vulnerable, and ever so sweet, and decorated with an Ottoman textile on her back, a Chintamani striped textile, and heavily bejeweled, as elephants often were. And so this lovely creature was going to be taken away to northern India, and this sort of painful separation takes place where the two elephants are separated, and Chanchal has to walk all the way up with Asad Beg up to North India, which is a long, long walk. And he tells us in his memoirs that she is so upset at being separated and so sad at being taken away that the only way that he was able to comfort her ultimately was with gallons and gallons of Portuguese wine. That's a kind of incredible historical insight you have into all kinds of things, including elephants and their taste for Portuguese wine. But what an insight into the life of an elephant, into the emotional life of an elephant, and into the fact that you can actually see the painted record of the elephants that have been captured with so much sensitivity and feeling by a great artist like Farrukh Hussain, who had previously, who normally does kings and important sort of royal figures, but applies his emotional sensitivity to the subject matter of a pair of elephants.
Actually, I think that when societies value animals and treat them well and capture them in their art, it says something about them.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And the one great thing about Indian culture in general, even though, modernity has brought about a lot of bad treatment of animals, but I think that fundamentally the culture at every level is based on the relationship, the loving relationship between man and animal.
And in thinking about all of the things you've been telling me, expensive textiles and metalware and diamonds, there's an element of, I imagine that many of these things were also produced for women. Are these dowry items given to women in marriage, or how do women figure in the story of these luxury items?
Well, I mean, yes, firstly, they're luxury items because we're essentially talking about court culture and court production. The courts were incredibly rich. What lay beyond the courts, of course, was the harsh reality of the life of the peasant and the life of, and there was also a sort of middle class trade as well to some extent. So, there are different echelons of life and of artistic production. And even at the level of village and nomadic and peasant life, there's a great creativity, and you find wonderful works of art that are produced in mud brick and in very humble materials in humble context, but are filled with artistic, inspiration and originality, and have great value. So that's just to contextualize what we're talking about. As far as women are concerned, yes, women patrons have emerged, and they've been studied now quite a lot, both in North India and in South India. And in the Deccan, there were many important women. I mean, some of these items would have been made for them, but believe it or not, it was men who were wearing as many jewels as women back in the day, turban ornaments, rings, and necklaces and belts and so on. So that was, much of this was made for men as well. When I try to think of an interesting figure who's a woman, I mean, I would think of a character like Chand Bibi, who was from the kingdom of Ahmednagar, the kingdom we haven't talked about yet, which was on the western coast. And this kingdom was very interesting because it was basically, in its high moment, ruled by an expatriate named Malik Ambar, who was from Ethiopia and was one of the many, many brilliant nobles of African origin who integrated in the courts of the Deccan. And Malik Ambar has a fascinating story too, and a lot of scholarship has been done on him. He emerged as a kind of slave and came to the Deccan, where he became heavily involved with Chand Bibi, who was the ruling queen of Ahmednagar. And the two of them together formed a kind of great alliance and partnership. And in fact, in the end, he was more or less the de facto ruler of the court, but she was a very powerful figure too. They fought off the Mughals for 26 years. Eventually, the kingdoms fell to Mughal conquest, but not before. Malik Ambar in particular had invented guerrilla warfare, in that he learned how to attack a large imperial army through new methods of military sort of strategy, including moving with small troops very rapidly at night. But really, his relationship with Chand Bibi is very interesting. What was the nature of the relationship? We don't know. We don't know of a lot of works of art that were commissioned by her, but she emerges as a kind of heroic queen figure and a woman in the 16th century who emerges as a kind of fighter, a military, a person who's active on the warfare, and who may have been in a personal, intimate relationship with Malik Ambar. So yeah, much to wonder about.
I was wondering, you've captured these historic crafts and art so well. What about today? Do the craft traditions of the Deccan still survive? Are they still as important and attractive to the world?
Well, I think with the advent of modernity, the whole structure of patronage and artistic production has dramatically changed all over the world. You don't have the relationship between artist and patron in the same way anymore. Artists are now free to express themselves without a pay. I mean, they're free to be individuals in one sense, in every sense, but they also have to find their own patrons now. And so just like any other city in the world that has evolved into a kind of modern identity, you have places like Hyderabad and Bangalore and vibrant cities all over the Deccan region, which are centers of art and creativity and new forms of artistic expression to do with a completely new vocabulary, a new identity for artists and so on. So that's very much happening. In terms of the traditional crafts, yes, you still have textile production, you have wonderful jewelry production, you have metalwork. Is it innovative? Is it inspired? Is it sort of repeating? I mean, there's a lot of repetition of things. Styles have a moment of excitement when they're first conceived, and then a kind of great development in the early phase, and then usually the things kind of become a little stiff and repetitive, and so you do have that kind of production as well. I mean, a kind of afterlife of something that was invented 400 years ago. I'm not sort of saying it's only that, because also within the art of kalamkari, within the different textile arts, you do have some amount of innovation. But the heyday of all of these, the really creative moment of birth and sort of creativity of textiles, for example, of kalamkari textiles, was in the 17th century.
So it's at this moment of great cultural fusion, of local tradition, of northern traditions, of European influence and demands and requests, I suppose.
Yes, but I wouldn't want to privilege those influences over what is essentially the heart of the Deccan identity itself, because the influences have to act upon something that is real and true and solid. Otherwise, you have nothing there, and that would be wrong. The real story is that the Deccan, in its own way, with all of these influences as kind of out there, came up with its own kind of efflorescence, with its own extraordinary artistic expressions for this period of about 200 years before it vanished into a kind of Mughal hegemony. And it's mysterious because it wasn't very long. and it vanished into thin air. And actually, Jackie Kennedy visited the Deccan. She visited Hyderabad and left a letter, which has been published a few times, in which she has a very poignant line saying that she loves things best when she knows they cannot last, because it's like a flower; it just blooms for a moment, and then it's never the same. And so you do have, it happens. That's a story of history, I guess, but it happened with the Deccan. It happened in the 16th and 17th century, and when the Mughals took over, and the new forms of artistic creativity came about. You have Hyderabad, you have the Mughal traditions at Hyderabad. The Nizams of Hyderabad always thought of themselves as Mughals because that's what they originally were. But the style of Hyderabadi art, the art that was made for the Nizams of Hyderabad, is so indebted to Mughal tradition that it's blended very profoundly now Mughal influence into the whole thing, whereas the previous phase was much more independent. It's that sort of moment of Deccani identity, of Deccani uniqueness that existed in the 16th and 17th century. That's what we tried to show in the exhibition that we did on the subject at the Met in 2015.
Today, if someone wants to discover this moment of flowering you talk about so passionately, what's the best way to find out about it?
Well, I have to say that, Deccani art constitutes one of the rarest categories of Indo-Islamic art or Islamic art, in that it's much rarer surviving material, rarer than Ottoman, more rare than Safavid, more rare than Mughal. There just isn't that much that survives. So it's not easy to see this. You can see museum collections have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 extraordinary pieces, if they're lucky, spread out in many, many places all over the world in terms of the portable arts, the paintings and the textiles and the metalwork pieces and the diamonds. Now, if you were to go to the Deccan region today, you would see a great amount of the architectural heritage that remains. And for that, you would have to be quite an adventurer, because the Deccan is developed in a funny kind of a way. I mean, you've got these booming cities like Hyderabad and Bangalore, but then you have countryside that feels like it's not at all developed. So when you actually go traveling, you could go from a very, cyber city, and a few hours later you find yourself bumping along a dirt road for hours and hours trying to get to the next monument or the small town that holds a monument. It's still in development. You still have to be a bit of an adventurer, a little bit of, be quite intrepid and be prepared for a bit of a rough ride at moments, but then you're rewarded by seeing wonderful buildings. And one of the things that's so special to me about the Deccan is the fact that the landscape is extraordinary. The planet's oldest rock formations, apparently they're the oldest rock formations, are in the Deccan Plateau, and these rocks rise up from the surface in kind of spectacular arrangements that have been sort of put together by a divine hand. I mean, balanced on top of each other, or just emerging in these kind of strange shapes. And of course, all the societies and civilizations that existed around them responded to this landscape in different ways. They appear in the Deccani paintings. The buildings are structured around them, temples and so on arise from them. It's kind of amazing how the rocky landscape has a large role to play. And I'm sorry to say that today a lot of those extraordinary rocks are being exploded, dynamited to make cement for the growing cities. But if you're lucky and you manage to get out to remote spots, or to particularly areas where the Vijayanagar Empire, which sort of was the neighboring empire to the south, you get to those areas around Hampi, you'll see amazing landscapes as well, apart from the built environment. So it's really, there's a lot to enjoy and to learn from in the Deccan region.
Well, thank you so much, Navina. You really inspire us with not only the ability to discover textiles and diamonds and free-thinking artists, but also to remind us that the landscape is also part of the culture and worth preserving. And I hope that through your exhibitions at the Met and through your work, more people will discover the way in which Deccani culture comes together and how it's all valuable, not just the most beautiful aspects of it, but the nature as well.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about it.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.